Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to the sun-drenched, scandal-ridden heart of the Roman Empire. Picture this. You're not a legionary trudging through mud or a senator droning on about taxes, but rather, you're an invited guest, or perhaps an accidental fly on the wall at the imperial palace. The air is thick with exotic perfumes, distant music drifts from unseen courtyards, and everywhere you look, there's an almost blinding shimmer. Why? Because you're about to meet an emperor whose entire life was practically a soft, silken whisper, an emperor so obsessed with the smooth, flowing fabric that he made it his personal mission to be draped in it, head to toe, at every waking moment. You'll soon realize that while your comfiest pajamas might be cotton, his were, well, significantly more opulent. And honestly, you probably wouldn't survive a single dinner party at his place without committing some fashion faux pas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're drifting back to the early 3rd century AD, to a time when Rome was still mighty, but perhaps a little eccentric. Our protagonist, or perhaps our antagonist depending on your viewpoint, is a young man named Elagabalus. He wasn't born in Rome, which was already a bit of a red flag for the traditionalists. No, Elagabalus hailed from Emesa, in the Roman province of Syria. His family was prominent there, deeply connected to the local cult of the sun god Elagabal. This deity, often represented by a large black conical stone, was the central focus of his family's existence, and Elagabalus himself was, in fact, the chief priest of this very cult. Imagine growing up knowing your main job in life is to interpret the will of a giant rock. Talk about pressure. When Elagabalus ascended to the purple, as they called becoming emperor, it wasn't through the usual channels of military prowess or senatorial decree. It was, rather, through a clever bit of political maneuvering by his grandmother, Julia Misa, a woman who could probably outmaneuver a Roman legion with just a wink and a smile. She essentially convinced the 3rd Gallic Legion that her grandson, Elagabalus, was actually the illegitimate son of the recently deceased and much beloved Emperor Caracalla. A little bit of fake news, Roman style, and suddenly, this teenage priest from Syria was poised to rule the known world. It's almost like a really elaborate episode of Succession, but with more togas and less central heating. Now, why is he our emperor tonight? Because Elagabalus, among his many eccentricities, developed an obsession with silk. Not just wearing it occasionally, mind you, but practically living in it. We're talking silk tunics, silk cloaks, silk sandals, perhaps even silk underwear. Though historians are still arguing whether ancient Romans actually wore underwear in the way we understand it. It was, for him, the ultimate expression of luxury, softness, and probably just a delightful sensation against the skin. Imagine going from rough wool and linen to the smooth caress of silk every single day. You might become a bit obsessed too, perhaps. This wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a societal earthquake. Silk, at this time, was the height of exotic luxury. It didn't grow on trees in Italy, nor did sheep magically produce it. It traveled thousands of miles, across treacherous deserts and towering mountains, from a land so distant, most Romans only knew it as Serica, the land of silk. To wear silk, especially pure silk, was to flaunt immense wealth and access to the most far-flung corners of the known world. And Elagabalus, this young, foreign emperor, seemed determined to flaunt it with an almost childlike abandon, much to the quiet horror of the more traditional Roman elite. They were used to a certain decorum, a certain austerity, and this silk-draped teenager was shaking up their world, one luxurious thread at a time. It's almost as if he was trying to annoy them on purpose, which, frankly, wouldn't be out of character. As you continue to drift, imagine the whispers that must have rippled through the marbled halls of Rome. Did you see what he was wearing today? Elagabalus's Syrian roots weren't just a geographic detail, they were a cultural earthquake. He arrived not as a grizzled general or a seasoned politician, but as a priest of a foreign sun god, bringing with him a whole new pantheon of traditions and, crucially for our story tonight, an entirely different aesthetic. The Romans, for all their conquests and cosmopolitanism, were deeply rooted in their own customs. They valued gravitas, a sense of seriousness and dignity, and a certain stoic austerity, even amidst their wealth. Think less Versace runway and more sensible business casual, but with more bronze statues. So, when young Elagabalus, a mere teenager, stepped onto the Roman stage, he did so not just with silk, but with a zeal for his Syrian sun god, Elagabal. He attempted to elevate this deity above Jupiter, the king of the Roman gods himself, even building a magnificent new temple, the Elagabalium, on the Palatine Hill. This was more than just a theological preference. It was a profound cultural clash. Romans saw their gods as integral to their identity, intertwined with the very fabric of the state. To introduce a new, black conical stone god and declare it supreme was, to many, an act of sacrilege and an affront to their traditions. It was like someone showing up to a grand old English tea party, ditching the Earl Grey, and insisting everyone now drink heavily spiced yak butter tea from a goblet. You can practically hear the polite coughs of discomfort. His personal habits, especially his clothing choices, became immediate flashpoints. While silk wasn't unknown in Rome, wealthy matrons might occasionally flaunt a sheer silk veil or a tunic with silk embroidery. It was typically used sparingly, often as an accent, and certainly not as the primary fabric for a man, let alone an emperor. For a Roman man, wool and linen were the mainstays, practical, durable, and suitably masculine. A man dressed predominantly in silk was seen as effeminate, weak, and un-Roman. It suggested a softness that went against the very core of Roman ideals of virility and martial prowess. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's flamboyant dress was a deliberate provocation, a genuine expression of his personal style, or simply a reflection of the more opulent, less gender-rigid fashion norms prevalent in his native Syria. Perhaps a bit of all three, seasoned with a healthy dose of youthful rebellion. Imagine the faces of the stern-faced senators, accustomed to the rough feel of their wool tunics, watching their new emperor glide past in shimmering, flowing silks that caught the light with every movement. It wasn't just a visual shock, it was a statement. A statement that screamed, "I am different, I am foreign, and I don't care for your stuffy traditions." This wasn't just about comfort. It was about power, or rather, a deliberate subversion of traditional Roman power aesthetics. He wasn't trying to fit in. He was actively, almost gleefully, standing out. The Roman public, particularly the old guard, watched with a mixture of bewilderment and growing disdain. They had seen extravagant emperors before, certainly. Nero had his golden palace and wild parties, and Caligula had his beloved horse as a consul. But Elagabalus's brand of extravagance felt different, more personal, and more culturally alien. It wasn't just luxury. It was luxury woven into a perceived assault on their very identity. The fact that he was so young, only about 14 when he became emperor, probably didn't help either. Imagine a teenager, given absolute power, who decides his first major reform is to revolutionize imperial fashion from drab wool to shimmering silk. It's almost endearing, if you ignore the potential for political instability it caused. This initial reaction set the tone for much of his brief, tumultuous reign. Every silk tunic, every exotic ritual, every deviation from Roman custom, chipped away at his legitimacy in the eyes of many. The stage was set for a confrontation between ancient tradition and a youthful, flamboyant emperor who simply wanted to wear what felt good. And what felt good, to Elagabalus, was silk. Lots and lots of silk. To truly understand Elagabalus's silk obsession, you need to appreciate the sheer journey this fabric undertook to reach the Roman Empire. We're not talking about a quick trip to the local textile mill. Silk, in the 3rd century AD, was a product of almost mythical origin, shrouded in mystery and whispered about in hushed tones. Its source was Serica, a land that, to most Romans, existed only as a vague, shimmering rumor on the eastern edge of the world. Today, we know this land as China, but back then, it was a place of exotic wonders and unimaginable distances. The Silk Road, a network of trade routes rather than a single road, was the lifeline that brought this precious fabric to the West. Imagine a journey spanning thousands of miles, across scorching deserts, over towering mountain ranges, and through lands teeming with bandits and rival empires. Caravans, laden with bolts of silk, faced perils at every turn. They battled sandstorms that could bury them alive, navigated treacherous passes where a single misstep meant certain death, and bartered with nomadic tribes whose languages and customs were utterly alien to them. It could take years for a single shipment of silk to reach Rome, and the risks involved inflated its value to astronomical levels. It's almost a miracle that any silk made it at all, given the sheer logistical nightmare involved. The process of making silk itself was a closely guarded secret, adding to its mystique and value. The Romans knew very little about silkworms or how they spun their delicate threads. They speculated wildly, some believing that silk grew on trees, others that it was harvested from a kind of exotic plant. Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist and encyclopedist, even suggested that silk was made by a kind of worm that spun the thread, but his description was vague and largely inaccurate. This lack of knowledge only deepened the allure of silk, transforming it from a mere fabric into a symbol of the exotic, the unattainable, and the downright magical. It was like owning a piece of a fairy tale, something so rare and precious that it defied easy explanation. The routes themselves were a patchwork of trails, constantly shifting and evolving with political alliances and the rise and fall of empires. There wasn't a single, clearly marked Silk Road, as we might imagine it today. Instead, it was a complex web of pathways, some overland, some by sea, each with its own dangers and rewards. Merchants might travel by camel caravan across the deserts of Central Asia, braving extreme temperatures and the constant threat of bandit raids. Others might sail along the coast of India, facing monsoons and pirates. And still others might take a more northerly route, through the steppes of what is now Russia, encountering nomadic tribes and the harsh realities of a freezing climate. Historians still debate the precise routes taken and the relative importance of each, but the overall picture is one of incredible complexity and resilience. The journey was so arduous, and the risks so high, that silk became one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, often worth its weight in gold. It wasn't just a fabric, it was a form of currency, a diplomatic gift, and a symbol of ultimate power and prestige. To possess silk was to announce to the world that you had the resources, the connections, and the sheer audacity to acquire something so incredibly rare and precious. And Elagabalus, as we'll see, had all three in abundance, along with a seemingly insatiable appetite for the stuff. He wasn't just wearing silk, he was wearing the very essence of the exotic, the far-off, and the impossibly luxurious. With silk's incredible journey in mind, you can begin to grasp its staggering value within Roman society. This wasn't just a fancy fabric. It was a textile of myth, a whisper from the farthest reaches of the known world, and an undeniable marker of unimaginable wealth. For the vast majority of Romans, silk was an exotic dream, something glimpsed perhaps on a wealthy senator's wife or a triumphant general, never something to be casually worn. It was the ancient equivalent of owning a private jet, or perhaps a solid gold yacht, completely out of reach for almost everyone, a status symbol that screamed, "I have arrived, and I have arrived expensively." Think of it this way. When silk reached Rome, after its perilous trek, its price soared. Each delicate thread, each shimmering weave, carried with it the accumulated cost of thousands of miles, countless middlemen, and immeasurable risk. Taxes and tariffs were levied at every border, adding layers of expense. The sheer weight of its rarity meant that only the wealthiest Romans could afford even a small scrap. A toga, a long, flowing garment worn by Roman citizens, if made entirely of silk, would have been an expenditure so vast it would have bankrupted a moderately prosperous family for generations. It was a statement piece in the truest sense, a fabric that didn't just adorn the body, but also declared one's financial supremacy to the world. This isn't to say silk was entirely unknown. Roman women of immense wealth might occasionally possess a sheer silk veil, sometimes dyed in vibrant, expensive colors like Tyrian purple, a dye derived from murex snails that was itself fantastically costly. Or perhaps a garment with intricate silk embroidery, a subtle nod to their elevated status. But these were accents, flourishes, not entire wardrobes. The very idea of a man, particularly an emperor, eschewing traditional wools and linens for head-to-toe silk was simply unheard of, a shocking display of decadence that flew in the face of established Roman norms. It was like wearing a diamond-encrusted tracksuit to a state dinner, completely out of step with expectations, yet undeniably eye-catching. The Roman moralists, ever keen to decry societal decay, often railed against the extravagance of silk. Seneca the Younger, a prominent Stoic philosopher, complained about the flimsy texture that scarcely covers the body, hinting at its perceived effeminacy and lack of practical use. They saw it not just as excessive, but as morally corrupting, a sign that Roman virtues of austerity and manliness were being eroded by foreign luxuries. This moral panic around silk reveals just how deeply ingrained its symbolism was. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about the perceived health of the Roman soul. Historians still argue about the true extent of silk's prevalence among the elite before Elagabalus, but there's a general consensus that his use of it dramatically pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. So, when Elagabalus arrived on the scene, clad in shimmering, flowing silk from dawn till dusk, he wasn't just making a fashion statement. He was making a provocative, expensive, and deeply unsettling declaration. He was rejecting centuries of Roman tradition, flaunting a level of wealth and ostentation that was both breathtaking and, to many, utterly vulgar. His silk wasn't just soft against his skin, it was a deliberate slap in the face to the conservative elements of Roman society. You can almost hear the collective gasp from the senators, a mix of outrage and perhaps a tiny, unadmitted flicker of envy. After all, who wouldn't want to be that comfortable all the time? Now that you've grasped the sheer cost and cultural impact of silk, let's zoom in on Elagabalus himself and his truly unprecedented use of this luxurious material. This wasn't about a tasteful silk scarf or a subtle trim on a tunic. We're talking about an emperor who redefined excess, turning his entire existence into a soft, shimmering, and often shocking silk spectacle. He reportedly wore only silk garments, day in and day out, from the moment he awoke until he finally drifted off to sleep. Imagine the laundry bill. Imagine the sheer volume of silkworms that had to make sacrifices for this one man's comfort. Our sources, primarily Roman historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian, paint a picture of a young man utterly unconcerned with Roman tradition or public opinion when it came to his attire. They describe him as often appearing in public in garments that were, by Roman standards, scandalously exotic and certainly effeminate. One particularly striking detail often recounted is his fondness for wearing garments woven entirely of pure silk, not just the blended silk commonly seen, which was already rare enough. This pure silk, known as sericum, was even more delicate, more translucent, and exponentially more expensive. It clung to the body, revealing contours in a way that traditional Roman wool or linen never would. For a Roman man, especially an emperor, this was a radical departure, a deliberate move away from the gravitas and modesty expected of his office. Consider his footwear. While Romans typically wore sturdy leather sandals or boots, Elagabalus reportedly sported silk sandals, often adorned with jewels. Can you imagine trekking through the dusty streets of Rome, or even navigating the marble floors of the palace in silk slippers? It screams comfort over common sense, which seems to have been a running theme for him. It also suggests a level of personal detachment from the practicalities of governance. He wasn't exactly leading legions from the front if he was worried about scuffing his silk footwear. His imperial bed, too, was a testament to his obsession. Instead of the typical woolen blankets and linen sheets, Elagabalus's bedchamber was reportedly furnished with silk sheets and quilts, and even silk pillows. This isn't just about luxury. It's about an almost sensory immersion in the fabric. Every surface he touched, every moment of rest, was enveloped in the soft, cool caress of silk. One can almost picture him sighing contentedly as he sank into his silken slumber, utterly oblivious to the political storm brewing outside his lavish chambers. This level of indulgence was so extreme that it raised eyebrows even in an empire accustomed to imperial excesses. Nero, for instance, had his golden house, but his fashion choices were perhaps less outwardly provocative. Caligula had his infamous horse, Incitatus, but he didn't fundamentally alter the imperial dress code. Elagabalus, however, seemed determined to rewrite the rules of imperial appearance, not just for himself, but for his entire court. He encouraged, and sometimes even insisted upon, his courtiers adopting similar lavish attire, turning the imperial palace into a veritable fashion show of shimmering fabrics and exotic designs. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate attempt to undermine Roman masculine ideals, a genuine expression of his Syrian cultural heritage, or simply the unchecked whim of a spoiled and all-powerful teenager. Perhaps it was a combination of all three, seasoned with a healthy dose of "because I can." His unique fashion choices weren't just about comfort. They were a profound statement. Each silk garment, each jewel-encrusted slipper, was a silent challenge to the Roman way of life, a soft, shimmering rebellion against centuries of tradition. And as you'll soon see, this defiance of Roman norms, wrapped up in yards of expensive silk, did not go unnoticed, nor did it go unpunished. As you settle deeper into this silken journey, let's explore the specific garments and fabric follies that made Elagabalus such a scandalous figure in Roman society. It wasn't just that he wore silk, but how he wore it and the types of garments he chose that truly baffled and often infuriated the traditionalists. Imagine waking up in a Rome accustomed to sturdy, practical tunics and the dignified folds of a wool toga, and then encountering an emperor dressed like he just stepped out of a highly extravagant, incredibly comfortable, and utterly foreign dream. Our Roman sources, particularly those hostile to Elagabalus, delight in detailing his sartorial transgressions. He was said to favor long, flowing tunics of pure silk, often dyed in vibrant, almost shocking colors that were rarely seen on Roman men. While Roman tunics were generally simple and practical, Elagabalus's were described as elaborate, almost theatrical. They weren't just functional undergarments. They were statements. Picture a Roman man's tunic ending just above the knee, modest and masculine, compared to Elagabalus's version, perhaps trailing around his ankles, perhaps adorned with intricate embroidery or even pearls. It's like turning up to a business meeting in a ball gown, completely out of context and undeniably attention-grabbing. Beyond the length and material, there was the notorious issue of his stola. The stola was traditionally a garment worn by Roman women, a long, flowing dress that signified a respectable matron. For a man, let alone an emperor, to wear a stola was considered an extreme act of effeminacy and a profound insult to Roman masculinity. Yet, according to Cassius Dio, Elagabalus would sometimes don this garment, often decorated with gold and precious stones, much to the horror of his male courtiers and senators. This wasn't just a quirky fashion choice. It was a public performance, a deliberate subversion of gender roles and societal expectations that deeply unsettled the conservative Roman elite. You can almost hear the collective gasp of scandalized whispers echoing through the forum. He also had a penchant for loose-fitting, sheer silk garments that were far removed from the structured drapery of traditional Roman attire. These might have been more akin to what wealthy Syrian or Persian nobles wore, designed for warmer climates and a different sense of modesty. For Romans, who valued modesty and a certain dignified concealment, these sheer fabrics were perceived as shockingly revealing, bordering on indecent for a male figure, let alone the head of their empire. It was as if he was purposefully blurring the lines, not just of gender, but of public and private display. And let's not forget the sheer quantity of silk. It wasn't just one or two prize garments. Elagabalus reportedly had an entire wardrobe of silk, changing outfits multiple times a day. He might have a different silk tunic for breakfast, another for his public audiences, and yet another for his lavish dinner parties. This constant change, this endless parade of exotic fabrics, was itself a form of ostentation. It spoke of boundless wealth and a disregard for the careful conservation of resources that was, at least in theory, valued by the Roman state. This overt embrace of non-Roman, seemingly effeminate, and excessively luxurious clothing became a central theme in the criticisms leveled against him by later historians. They used his fashion choices as shorthand for his perceived moral decay, his foreignness, and his unsuitability to rule. Historians still argue about the true motivations behind these sartorial choices. Was it genuine self-expression? A calculated political statement of defiance? Or simply the naive indulgence of a young man given absolute power? Whatever the reason, Elagabalus's fashion legacy remains perhaps the silkiest and certainly one of the most scandalous in Roman history. Beyond his personal wardrobe, Elagabalus ensured that silk wasn't just on him, but around him, permeating every aspect of his imperial life. Imagine stepping into the grand dining halls of the Roman palace, not to the usual sturdy oak tables and ceramic dishes, but into a dreamscape of shimmering fabric. This wasn't just about a tablecloth. It was about an entire environment bathed in the soft glow of silk. His banquets, already legendary for their excess and peculiar entertainment, became multi-sensory experiences dominated by silk. Instead of standard Roman table coverings, he reportedly used silk tablecloths, perhaps even woven with intricate patterns or gold threads. Imagine the soft rustle as servants laid out platters of exotic foods, the fabric barely disturbed by the weight of silver and gold. And it didn't stop there. He was also said to have draped the very couches on which guests reclined with silk cushions and throws. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about creating an atmosphere of unparalleled luxury, a sensory overload that was both breathtaking and, to the more conservative Romans, deeply unsettling. The imperial palace itself underwent a silk transformation. While Roman homes, even opulent ones, generally relied on frescoes, mosaics, and marble for their decor, Elagabalus introduced swathes of silk tapestries and hangings. These weren't just decorative. They would have transformed the acoustics and lighting of the rooms, muffling sounds and diffusing the harsh Roman sun into a softer, more ethereal glow. Imagine walking through a corridor where instead of cold stone, vibrant silk curtains billowed gently with every draft, softening the edges of the grand architecture. It must have been a truly alien sensation for anyone accustomed to the typical Roman aesthetic. Even the everyday accessories became infused with a silken touch. Rather than simple baskets for fruits or flowers, he might have used silk-lined baskets. For his famous, or infamous, spectacles involving exotic animals, he allegedly had their cages or enclosures decorated with silk. You can almost picture a lion, perhaps slightly bewildered, gazing out from behind bars draped in shimmering scarlet silk. It sounds almost comical, but it speaks volumes about his pervasive desire to infuse every facet of his life with this one luxurious material. This all-encompassing use of silk extended to even the most mundane items. His litter, the enclosed couch on which he was carried through the city, was said to be lined with silk. Even the ropes and handles might have been adorned with silk tassels or wrapped in silk threads. Every interaction, every surface, every movement was designed to be as soft and luxurious as possible. It was an imperial cocoon of comfort, insulating him from the harsher realities of Roman life, or perhaps from the grumbling discontent of his subjects. This level of immersion in silk wasn't just an expression of personal taste. It was a profound declaration of status, a deliberate breaking of norms. No previous emperor had shown such an overt and constant reliance on such an exotic and expensive material for everyday living. Historians still argue about the precise motivations behind this extreme indulgence. Was it a genuine, almost childlike fascination with beauty and softness? A deliberate attempt to differentiate himself from his predecessors and flaunt his immense power? Or was it simply the unchecked whim of a young man with unlimited resources and a penchant for the bizarre? Whatever the underlying reason, Elagabalus managed to weave silk into the very fabric of his controversial reign, making it almost as much a part of his legend as his religious reforms and his gender fluidity. As you recline, perhaps even a bit more comfortably now, let's consider how Elagabalus's lavish attire and particular affinity for silk became intertwined with deeper issues of gender expression in Roman society. This wasn't just about an emperor having expensive taste. It was about a powerful figure deliberately challenging the very definition of Roman masculinity and femininity, often through his clothing. Roman society, as you might recall, was built on rather rigid gender roles. Men were expected to be stoic, virile, and outwardly masculine. Their clothing, typically the simple tunic and the dignified toga, reflected this ideal: practical, unadorned, and clearly distinct from women's attire. Women, on the other hand, wore longer, flowing garments like the stola, and their adornments, though often elaborate, were meant to signify their modesty and domesticity. But Elagabalus seemed to delight in blurring these lines, using silk as his chosen medium for this sartorial rebellion. He was often depicted, and indeed chose to appear, in garments traditionally associated with women. We've already touched on the stola, a a scandalous choice for a man. But he also favored veils and head coverings, which were typically worn by women for modesty or religious purposes. Imagine the sheer audacity, in the eyes of a conservative Roman senator, of seeing their emperor, the very embodiment of Roman power, appear in public draped in silks and veils that screamed feminine to every traditional observer. It was a direct affront to their understanding of what a male ruler, or even a male citizen, should be. Furthermore, the very nature of silk, its softness, its flowing drape, its often translucent quality, was seen as inherently effeminate by Roman standards. Unlike the sturdy, rough wools that symbolized masculine vigor, silk was delicate and luxurious. For Elagabalus to clad himself entirely in this material was seen as a profound embrace of softness over strength, of indulgence over duty. It suggested a lack of virtus, the Roman ideal of manliness encompassing courage, moral integrity, and duty. It was like a modern-day CEO showing up to a high-stakes board meeting in a silk negligee, utterly out of place and designed to provoke. Beyond just wearing feminine clothes, ancient sources, particularly the hostile ones, describe Elagabalus's broader presentation as effeminate. They claim he wore makeup, plucked his body hair, and even walked with a swaying gait, all of which were perceived as highly unconventional for a Roman man. While these accounts are almost certainly exaggerated by biased historians eager to discredit him, they underscore how his appearance, particularly his silk-draped form, contributed to the perception of him as transgressing traditional gender boundaries. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus genuinely identified as gender fluid in a way we might understand today, or if his actions were a deliberate political statement, a cultural expression from his Syrian background where gender roles might have been interpreted differently, or simply the unchecked indulgence of a powerful youth. This intentional blurring of gender lines through his silk fashion was not a quiet protest. It was a loud, visual declaration. It was a deliberate rejection of Roman expectations, designed to shock and to assert his personal while over-entrenched cultural norms. For a society that placed such a high premium on public image and clear distinctions, Elagabalus's silk-draped, gender-ambiguous appearances were a constant source of scandal and a fundamental challenge to the very fabric of Roman identity. He wasn't just wearing silk, he was wearing controversy. As you nestle deeper into your sleep, let's explore the thunderous Roman reaction to Elagabalus's silken defiance. His choices weren't just private quirks, they were public provocations, and the Roman people, especially the powerful elite, did not remain silent. Their perception of him, heavily influenced by his extravagant silk habits and perceived effeminacy, rapidly morphed from bewilderment to outright disgust and open scandal. The historical accounts we have, largely from Cassius Dio and Herodian, were written by men who were contemporaries or near contemporaries of Elagabalus, and they offer a scathing portrayal. They weren't just reporting facts, they were actively shaping public opinion and condemning what they saw as moral decay. In their writings, Elagabalus's silk garments become shorthand for his alleged debauchery, his foreignness, and his unsuitability for the imperial throne. Every mention of his flowing robes or his womanly attire was designed to elicit shock and righteous indignation from their Roman audience. It's almost like a really dramatic tabloid expose, but with more intricate historical context and considerably higher stakes. For the Roman elite, particularly the senators, Elagabalus's silk-draped presence was a constant source of mortification. They had been accustomed to emperors who, even if privately depraved, maintained a facade of dignity and traditional Roman virtues in public. Elagabalus shattered this facade with every shimmering stride. His attire was a public rejection of Roman gravitas, the solemn dignity and seriousness expected of a leader. It wasn't just bad taste. It was seen as an insult to the very foundations of the Roman state, a symbolic crumbling of their values, one silk thread at a time. Imagine a formal senatorial meeting, grave men in their traditional togas, discussing matters of war and state finance, and then in sweeps Elagabalus, perhaps in a shimmering pink silk tunic, adorned with jewels, and a faint, exotic perfume wafting behind him. The sheer disconnect between the seriousness of the affairs of state and the emperor's flamboyant appearance would have been jarring. It undercut his authority, making him seem frivolous and unconcerned with the weighty responsibilities of his office. Historians still argue about whether this dismissal was purely due to his perceived effeminacy, or if his youth and foreign religious practices played an equal or greater role in fueling the disdain of the Roman establishment. It was probably a delightful cocktail of all three, with a silken garnish. The public, too, was subjected to his displays. While many might have been fascinated or amused by the spectacle, the underlying message was often one of unease. Rome had its own set of expectations for its emperors, and Elagabalus consistently failed to meet them. His preference for silk was just one facet of a broader pattern of behavior that alienated him from his subjects. His extravagant banquets, his insistence on elevating his Syrian sun god, and his perceived sexual promiscuity all contributed to a narrative of an emperor who was un-Roman. And the silk, being so visibly and undeniably other, became an easily recognizable symbol of this perceived deviance. Ultimately, the public and historical perception of Elagabalus became inextricably linked with his silk obsession. It wasn't just a detail, it was a defining characteristic, painted by his critics as proof of his weakness, his moral corruption, and his ultimate unsuitability for rule. His silken world, designed for comfort and self-expression, ironically became a powerful weapon in the hands of those who sought to dismantle his short, tumultuous reign. The silken scandal surrounding Elagabalus wasn't just confined to whispers in the forum or the disapproving glances of senators. His perceived excesses, particularly his flamboyant attire and foreign religious practices, began to fuel genuine political unrest. The Roman Senate, the ancient and powerful body that traditionally legitimized imperial rule, grew increasingly uncomfortable with this young, unpredictable, and frankly, un-Roman emperor. They were used to subtle power plays, not outright fashion rebellions, and this constant visual defiance began to fester into serious plots. The Senate, composed largely of old, established families, valued tradition and stability above all else. Elagabalus, with his cult of the sun god Elagabal and his insistence on wearing pure silk instead of dignified wool, was seen as a disruptive force, threatening the very fabric of Roman identity. His lavish spending on exotic silks and other luxuries also strained the imperial treasury, which was a very real concern for a state that relied on constant military readiness and administrative efficiency. Imagine a board of directors watching their young CEO drain the company's funds on an endless supply of designer clothes. The alarm bells would be deafening. Beyond the financial and cultural concerns, there was a more insidious fear that Elagabalus's perceived weakness and effeminacy would undermine Rome's standing in the eyes of its enemies. A strong, masculine emperor was considered essential for maintaining the empire's military prowess and deterring barbarian incursions. An emperor who spent his days draped in silk and participating in exotic rituals was, to many, a dangerous liability. This wasn't just about fashion, it was about national security. The growing discontent wasn't limited to the Senate. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor, also became increasingly disillusioned. These were hardened soldiers, often from humble backgrounds, who valued strength and discipline. They found Elagabalus's lifestyle, particularly his disregard for Roman military traditions and his apparent lack of interest in their welfare, deeply off-putting. The idea of serving an emperor who preferred silk tunics to armor and whose religious ceremonies seemed utterly alien chipped away at their loyalty. You can imagine a grizzled centurion grumbling to his comrades, "He's more interested in what silk veil to wear than checking our supply lines." It was Elagabalus's powerful grandmother, Julia Misa, who had initially engineered his rise to power, who now recognized the looming danger. She was a shrewd political operator, and she understood that her grandson's unchecked behavior, including his silk obsession, was pushing the empire to the brink. She saw the whispers turning into open resentment, the discomfort hardening into active conspiracy. To save her family's power, and perhaps even her own life, she began to subtly orchestrate his downfall. Historians still argue whether she genuinely cared for the stability of Rome or merely for the continuation of her family's dynasty, but her actions clearly showed a keen awareness of the ticking clock. She began to promote her other grandson, Elagabalus's cousin, Alexander Severus, as a more suitable heir. Alexander was everything Elagabalus wasn't: serious, traditional, and seemingly more aligned with Roman values. This created a dangerous rivalry within the imperial household, exacerbating Elagabalus's isolation. His silken world, once a comfort, became a fragile barrier against a growing tide of animosity, a tide that was about to break. As you continue to drift, imagine the Roman treasury under Elagabalus's silken hand. The emperor's insatiable demand for silk wasn't just a personal indulgence. It had tangible and significant economic impacts on the vast Roman Empire. Silk, as we've discussed, was incredibly expensive. To have an emperor who demanded it for virtually everything, from his clothes to his curtains, meant a constant, colossal outflow of Roman gold and silver to distant lands. Think of the sheer logistics. Thousands of miles away, in the heart of China, silkworms were diligently spinning their cocoons, and skilled artisans were weaving the threads into fabric. This product then had to traverse the entire length of the Silk Road, passing through numerous hands, each taking their cut. Every caravan leader, every local chieftain, every border guard, and every merchant along the way exacted a toll or a profit. By the time that shimmering bolt of silk reached Rome, its price had inflated exponentially, far beyond its initial production cost. For Rome, this meant a consistent drain of precious metals. Unlike today, where complex global financial systems allow for various forms of trade and payment, in the ancient world, trade imbalances often meant a physical transfer of wealth. Roman coins, minted from gold and silver, were literally flowing eastward to pay for these luxuries. While the Roman Empire was vast and wealthy, a sustained outflow of specie on non-essential goods could, over time, weaken its economic foundations. It was like having a perpetually leaky bucket, with the leak being highly fashionable and incredibly soft. Historians still argue about the precise scale of this economic drain. Was Elagabalus's personal silk consumption truly enough to destabilize the vast Roman economy? Probably not on its own, but it certainly contributed to a broader problem of luxury imports. The Roman elite, not just the emperor, had a taste for exotic goods, spices from India, precious stones from the East, and, of course, silk. This collective demand, fueled by the desire for status and comfort, meant a constant, low-level hemorrhage of wealth. Elagabalus simply magnified this trend to an absurd degree, making it highly visible and therefore highly criticized. Furthermore, his preference for pure silk meant less demand for local Roman industries like wool and linen production. While not a catastrophic blow, it certainly shifted economic priorities and perhaps even led to resentment among local producers. Imagine a Roman textile manufacturer proudly weaving sturdy woolens, watching the imperial purse go to foreign silk merchants. It's enough to make one grumble over a tankard of cheap wine. This economic aspect wasn't lost on contemporary critics. Roman authors often condemned the excessive import of luxuries, not just for moral reasons, but for the tangible drain on Roman wealth. They saw it as an indulgence that weakened the state, diverting resources that could have been used for more productive purposes, such as funding legions or building infrastructure. Elagabalus's silk obsession thus became a potent symbol of perceived financial mismanagement and a symptom of a broader societal decline. In essence, every silken garment worn by Elagabalus was not just a personal choice. It was a tiny thread in the larger tapestry of Roman economics, a thread that highlighted the empire's vast trade networks, its insatiable appetite for luxury, and the constant flow of wealth that underpinned its power, or, in this case, slowly bled from it. As you float effortlessly through the Roman past, you might wonder if Elagabalus was truly unique in his extravagance, or if he merely pushed the boundaries of what was already a fairly opulent imperial tradition. While his silk obsession was certainly particular to him, we can compare his lavishness to other notable rulers throughout history who also enjoyed the finer, and often most expensive, things in life. This helps us place his Saracum-soaked reign in a broader context of imperial indulgence. Consider, for instance, Nero, another Roman emperor from an earlier century. Nero was famous for his artistic inclinations and his notorious Golden House, Domus Aurea, a sprawling palace built after the Great Fire of Rome, complete with vast gardens, an artificial lake, and rooms adorned with gold leaf, precious stones, and intricate frescoes. He was known for his lavish parties, his passion for chariot racing, and his love of public performance. While he didn't have the same textile obsession as Elagabalus, his overall lifestyle certainly screamed excess. Nero's luxury was about grand architectural statements and entertainment, while Elagabalus's was more about personal sensory immersion, often in exotic fabrics. You could say Nero built the party, and Elagabalus dressed for it. Moving beyond Rome, think of Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. His palace of Versailles was a monument to opulence, its halls dripping with gold, crystal chandeliers, and mirrors. Louis's court was a theater of elaborate rituals and extravagant fashion, with courtiers vying to outdo each other in silks, satins, and lace. He himself wore incredibly rich fabrics, often embroidered with silver and gold thread. The key difference here is that Louis XIV's luxury was a deliberate tool of statecraft, designed to awe foreign dignitaries and keep his nobility distracted and dependent on him. Elagabalus's silk, while certainly a statement, felt more like a personal fixation than a calculated political strategy. Louis's silks were about power projection. Elagabalus's were about personal comfort and perhaps provocation. Further east, the Byzantine emperors were renowned for their love of silk. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, became a major center for silk production after silkworm eggs were smuggled out of China. Their imperial garments were often incredibly ornate, woven with gold thread and adorned with pearls and jewels. But even their opulence, while stunning, was often deeply intertwined with religious symbolism and a long-standing tradition of ceremonial splendor. It was part of their imperial identity, a continuation of Roman and Eastern traditions, not a radical departure. Elagabalus, by contrast, wasn't following a tradition. He was creating his own, very strange one. And then there's Cleopatra VII of Egypt, known for her legendary allure and strategic use of luxury. While not an empress in the Roman sense, her encounters with Roman leaders like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were famous for their displays of Egyptian wealth, including rich fabrics, perfumes, and jewels. She used these displays to project power and fascination, but again, her luxury was often a calculated political move, not simply personal indulgence. So, while Elagabalus certainly stands out for his singular focus on silk, he fits within a long line of rulers who used wealth and extravagance as part of their imperial persona. What makes him particularly noteworthy is the degree to which his silk obsession became a point of scandal rather than admiration, and how it intertwined with profound cultural and gender norm challenges. Historians still argue whether his excesses were merely a symptom of his youth and unchecked power, or if they represented a more deliberate, albeit ill-fated, attempt to redefine Roman imperial identity. Either way, his silk was definitely talking. Let's gently ease into imagining a typical day for Elagabalus, enveloped in his silken world. As the morning light filtered into the imperial palace, it wouldn't have met the rough surfaces of common Roman decor, but rather would have diffused softly through sheer silk hangings, casting a gentle, almost ethereal glow. You, as a privileged observer, might notice the absolute stillness, the way the silk seemed to absorb sound, creating a private, hushed sanctuary for the emperor. His awakening wouldn't have been to the abrasive touch of wool. Instead, he would have stirred in beds piled high with silk sheets and quilts, perhaps even scented with exotic incense from his Syrian homeland. Imagine the cool, smooth glide of the fabric against his skin as he stretched, perhaps reaching for a goblet of spiced wine brought by a servant whose own robes might have been of a finer weave than most Romans could ever dream of. His morning ablutions, too, would have been touched by luxury, perhaps with soft silk towels instead of rough linen. It was a complete sensory experience designed for ultimate comfort. His daily routine, while still involving state affairs, would have been punctuated by sartorial changes and a constant immersion in his preferred fabric. He wouldn't just dress once. He might change outfits multiple times throughout the day, each one a fresh display of pure silk, perhaps in varying hues, a shimmering green for morning audiences, a vibrant purple for an afternoon procession, a deep scarlet for evening banquets. Every movement would have caused the fabric to shimmer and flow, a living testament to his immense wealth and peculiar taste. You can almost hear the soft rustle of expensive fabric accompanying his every step. Even during formal functions, Elagabalus often seemed to prioritize personal comfort over rigid Roman protocol. While senators in their stiff togas might have been sweating in the Roman heat, he would likely have been relatively cool and comfortable in his loose, breathable silks. This might have been a subtle point of defiance, a quiet statement that his comfort superseded their rigid adherence to tradition. He wasn't just performing the role of emperor. He was performing it on his own terms, in his own ridiculously luxurious clothes. His meals would have been a particular delight for the senses. As we mentioned, not only were the dining couches draped in silk, but his napkins might have been of silk, and perhaps even some of the more elaborate dishes were served on silk-lined platters. Imagine the quiet sounds of delicate silverware against fine ceramic, muffled by the soft presence of silk everywhere. It was a world designed to appeal to every sense, creating an environment of almost unbelievable softness and indulgence. Historians still argue about the precise details of his daily meals, but the common thread, pun intended, is always one of extreme, often bizarre, luxury. Even his moments of leisure would have been infused with silk. Whether he was watching gladiatorial games from his imperial box, lounging in his private gardens, or engaging in his peculiar religious ceremonies, silk would have been his constant companion. He might have been carried in a litter lined with the finest silk, or reclined on silk cushions while listening to music. This wasn't just about wearing a fabric. It was about living within a silken bubble, a world almost entirely detached from the grittier realities of running a vast empire. His days were a testament to ultimate self-indulgence, a slow-paced, gently humorous historical fashion show, perfect for drifting off to sleep. Alas, even the softest silk could not cushion Elagabalus from the harsh realities of Roman politics. His reign, marked by an almost unbelievable level of personal indulgence and religious reform, was destined to be short-lived. The very excesses that made him so fascinating to us tonight ultimately led to his tragic and somewhat undignified downfall. The threads of his silken empire, once so tightly woven around him, began to unravel with alarming speed. Remember his astute grandmother, Julia Misa, the one who put him on the throne? She recognized the growing tide of resentment, particularly among the Praetorian Guard, who were the ultimate kingmakers and kingbreakers in Rome. Elagabalus's continuous disregard for Roman tradition, his perceived effeminacy, and his relentless focus on his sun-god cult alienated nearly everyone who mattered. He had, in essence, worn out his welcome, and his silk-clad defiance had become a liability rather than a statement. The decisive moment came when Julia Misa began to subtly promote her other grandson, Alexander Severus, as the heir apparent. Alexander, who was Elagabalus's cousin, was deliberately presented as everything Elagabalus was not: a traditionalist, a serious student, and someone who respected Roman values. He was even sent to the Senate to learn the ropes, a move that only highlighted Elagabalus's perceived frivolity. This created an immediate rivalry, which Elagabalus, in his perhaps naive arrogance, initially tried to suppress. He even attempted to have Alexander assassinated, but the Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty had already shifted, intervened. The Praetorian Guard, fed up with Elagabalus's eccentricities and perhaps swayed by Misa's machinations and promises, finally acted. On March 11, 222 AD, they revolted. Elagabalus, along with his mother, Julia Somias, attempted to flee, reportedly hiding in a latrine, a truly undignified end for an emperor who reveled in such luxury. He was discovered, dragged out, and brutally murdered. His body was then subjected to further humiliation, dragged through the streets of Rome, publicly mutilated, and finally tossed into the Tiber River. It was a violent and symbolic rejection of everything he represented, particularly his perceived un-Roman qualities. Historians still argue about the exact sequence of events during his final hours, but the outcome was undeniably brutal and swift. His downfall was swift and decisive, a harsh lesson that even absolute power, when wielded with such blatant disregard for cultural norms and political realities, has its limits. His silk, once a symbol of his power and unique identity, became a footnote in the story of his demise, easily ripped apart by the rough hands of a vengeful guard. The comfort he had so assiduously cultivated ultimately offered him no protection from the wrath of a society he had so thoroughly alienated. It was a stark reminder that Roman emperors ruled not just by decree, but by the uneasy consent of the powerful factions around them. And Elagabalus, wrapped in his silken cocoon, simply lost that consent. As the echoes of his violent end fade, we're left to reflect on the strange, shimmering legacy of Elagabalus, the Roman emperor who only wore silk. His reign, though brief and tumultuous, remains a fascinating, if perplexing, chapter in Roman history, largely remembered for its unparalleled eccentricity. He wasn't a great general or a brilliant administrator, but he certainly was a memorable fashion icon, at least in the most scandalous sense. His silk obsession, far from being a mere footnote, became a central metaphor for his entire reign in the eyes of subsequent historians. It symbolized his perceived effeminacy, his foreignness, and his utter disregard for Roman tradition. The rough, practical wool of the toga represented Roman virtue and masculinity. The flowing, exotic silk represented Elagabalus's deviation from these ideals. He inadvertently left behind a powerful visual legacy, forever intertwined with the shimmering fabric that defined his days. Historians still argue about the true motivations behind his actions, whether he was a genuine religious visionary, a gender nonconformist, or simply a wildly indulged teenager, but his silk remains a consistent, vivid detail in every account. Interestingly, despite the immediate condemnation, Elagabalus's reign marked a subtle shift in Roman imperial culture. While his excesses were reviled, the sheer luxury he introduced undoubtedly left its mark. The taste for exotic goods, including silk, would continue to grow among the Roman elite, albeit perhaps in less overt and scandalous ways. The Silk Road, remember, continued to operate, and the demand for its precious cargo persisted. He, in a way, accelerated the integration of Eastern luxuries into the Roman world, even if his personal methods were deemed too radical. It's almost like he jump-started a fashion trend, only to be promptly canceled for it. The story of Elagabalus serves as a powerful reminder that history is rarely, if ever, boring. Even the most seemingly trivial details, like an emperor's choice of clothing, can become rich lenses through which to examine profound cultural clashes, political machinations, and the ever-present tension between individual expression and societal expectation. His life, so dramatically lived, offers a glimpse into a world where identity was often performed, and where the softest fabric could ignite the fiercest controversy. So, as you drift off, perhaps imagining the cool, smooth touch of silk against your skin, remember Elagabalus. Remember the long journey of the silkworm, the perilous Silk Road, and the scandal that followed every shimmering thread. His was a life lived in exquisite, if sometimes absurd, comfort, a testament to the idea that sometimes the most peculiar historical figures are the ones who make the deepest and most memorable impressions. The sounds of the ancient world are fading now, the whispers of history becoming softer, more distant. The grand marble halls of Rome are settling into quietude, and the rustle of an emperor's silk robes is no more than a gentle breeze. You've journeyed far tonight, through empires and eccentricities, and now it's time to truly let go. The weight of the world is lifting, and the calm of deep rest is embracing you. Allow your breath to deepen, your muscles to relax, and your thoughts to simply float away like forgotten clouds. There's nothing left to do but surrender to the stillness. Let the ancient stories lull you into a peaceful, dreamless sleep.